Opening a game is no simple feat. Designers need to hook players from the get-go to avoid minds wandering off while also teaching the basics of the game. Established franchises can circumvent the need of a good intro to hook players, instead relying on a pre-built foundation of trust of, "This will get better, I promise." However, this isn't to say well-running franchises are inherently lazy, far from it. It just means focus can be lost along the way in favor of different mechanics, stories, or areas. The Legend of Zelda is one of the most popular and prolific series ever made, and each title offers a unique tale in newly set out worlds with their own iteration of Link. So I'd like to see how each game approaches introducing Link, the world around him, and the things he can do in it. Over the many iterations of Zelda, we've been given more and more intricate introductions. It's done everything from absolutely nothing to often complained about too drawn out sequences. With Breath of the Wild just around the corner, it looks to be returning to the roots of the series. Producer Eiji Aonuma has said it's possible to walk from the very beginning of the game right to the final showdown. While you'll be incredibly underprepared for the battle, the fact it's possible shows they're changing the Zelda franchise from the grand introductory conventions we've come to expect and flipping it upside down. With all that out of the way, let's go to where it all started. The original Legend of Zelda is a pretty well-known story at this point. Entering a cave, retrieving your sword from the old man, and setting off on your adventure. Now left to your own devices, the intro plays out as you wandering around the world of Hyrule to find your next temple. It's hard to say exactly when the intro technically ends because for most people, especially back in 1986, there were no online guides available and players had to rely on word of mouth and physical strategy guides to find their way. But it did a lot with what it could with the NES hardware. It set you up with a weapon and a world that was yours to now explore as you see fit. It's incredibly simple and primitive now, yes, but at the time the home console market had no real set rules in place for what needed to be done as an intro. What we're left with is what is now just seen as brutally hard old days. While fundamentally different in almost every way from all other entries into the long-running series, the adventure of Link's intro is similar to its predecessor in that it just lets players go into the world with a very minimal setup. All that is known is Princess Zelda is asleep and needs to be woken up. So after presenting its new 2D side-scrolling style in the opening chamber, players are given a few moments to play around with how to navigate before leaving to the overworld, which again is vastly different. A top-down Final Fantasy world where quasi-random encounters are prone to happen. After leaving the castle, players are offered a path leading them to where they need to go, yet it's free enough to explore as they see fit, but they will eventually be greeted by a small gang of enemies to avoid. Approaching any one of them will bring players back to that side-scrolling perspective from before, forcing them to learn how combat works on the fly. Upon surveying Hyrule and battling monsters, players discover the small town, where the importance of talking to locals to gain more knowledge of your quest is shown. Here, players will learn spells, get hints of where to go, and have health replenished. After leaving the town, it's intended to head over the road and through a cave to the first dungeon. Unlike its predecessor, it feels much less open. There was also more understanding of the NES hardware to make players feel less alone on their quest through the addition of towns and people that inhabit them. A Link to the Past is the first entry in which we're given a clear set of directions on where to go, as well as a setup for the overall story from the get-go. It also set the foundation of what a Zelda intro truly meant. Your uncle wakes you up, letting you know he's going off to the castle for a reason he won't yet disclose. And of course, Link follows him against his wishes. The argument could be made that the castle where Zelda is rescued from is the first dungeon, as it gives you an item, the boomerang, has a big key, and a heart container at the end. However, with there being no boss and the fact you return here at a much later time to finish it as a fully fledged dungeon, we will count entering the Eastern Palace as the end of the introduction. After exiting the sewers of the castle and leaving Zelda in the sanctuary, players are prompted to travel to Kakariko Village, which feels like a more fleshed out and contained version of that town in the previous game. While in Zelda 2 there are multiple towns to visit, Kakariko is set up as a hub of sorts to return to when required. This is highlighted by the intro telling players to gather information about the medallions, which show up on the map, pinpointing the locations of the first 3 dungeons, as well as the Master Sword. While Hyrule is free to explore at players' leisure, the game has a forced path to the Eastern Palace, using immovable boulders to block progress, making it a non-optional first dungeon. While the first 2 games have an intended order of dungeons, A Link to the Past set the trend of making dungeon order mandatory despite showing the player what else is available. It filters players through how it is meant to be experienced. It's also the first time we're introduced to Zelda in a meaningful way, outside of Zelda 1's pre-game text and her being asleep in Zelda 2. She's a fully realized character with stakes in the world being used as a motivator to push players forward on their adventure. The introduction to Ocarina of Time is something I took for granted for way too long. After completing it for the first time when the game released, I knew exactly how to do the sequence and was able to enter the Deku Tree within minutes of booting up the game. What I didn't realize until now was how genius this design choice is. After leaving Link's hut, then talking to Saria, it soon realized what's required to progress: the Kokiri sword and the Deku shield, the latter costing 40 rupees to buy. The cost of the shield is worked into every aspect of Kokiri village. Talking to each child and learning what they have to teach, such as picking up rocks and doing backflips, are rewarded with a small chunk of change to go towards the shield, incentivizing players to explore more and sowing the seed of talking to NPCs for rewards. Rupees can also be found by exploring some paths around the village, hinting further towards the open nature of what's to come later on. All of these things can take some time to complete the first time you play Ocarina of Time, including finding the grotto where the Kokiri sword is hidden. But this design choice also meant that every subsequent playthrough gets rolling with no real lost time, lending to great replayability, something that the series hasn't been able to capture well since. Majora's Mask introduces more of the world, story, and motives before leaving the starting area than any previous title. Through Skull Kid turning Link into a Deku Scrub, Tail giving the plea of the Four Giants, and the Happy Mask salesman unfolding the severity of the mask's power, we're given all the information and motivation needed to get to the end of the game. This perfectly fits in with the 3-day motif, as you'll reach the end of the game in the intro just without the items and songs required to access the final battle. Tatl leads the player to the Great Fairy Fountain to find her broken up, and what's needed is to find the stray fairy in order to get the magic bubble attack Deku Link wields. The endpoint of this intro is getting into the clock by midnight on the last night, achieved through completing a small fetch quest that, alongside interacting with the many NPCs going about their days, shows you how much side questing goes into this game, while also exemplifying that if you think outside the box, you will be rewarded with fun and satisfying mini-adventures. While Majora's Mask isn't as graceful in making its intro shorter through previous knowledge, if players find themselves stuck with a lot more time before midnight of the final day, it's possible to skip forward at 12-hour increments via the Scarecrow, who can also give you hints at the 2 different versions of the Song of Time that are not necessarily needed to complete the game, but will definitely help. For me, the intro ends once you enter the Southern Swamp, and if you want a more detailed look at why I consider that a dungeon, check out my Majora's Mask Dungeons and Items video. Wind Waker has one of the longest introductions to date, but it's so diverse, being spread across various locations, and has well thought out pacing that it really doesn't feel like it. And if you're wondering, I'm counting getting onto Dragon Roost Island and obtaining the Wind Waker instrument as the end of the intro here. This particular sequence was incredibly important for Nintendo to nail, because leading into the release of Wind Waker, people were immensely disappointed with the art direction, so it really had to show off why the cartoony cell shading was a smart change, and they really got it right, showcasing vibrant and wonderful colors alongside expressive facial animations that draw you in a wholly new way. What's interesting is for the very first time, we're given a full combat tutorial, which might sound tedious and a hindrance to the flow of the introduction, yet it manages to move along well, and it's intricately worked into the story of Outset Island. Players are introduced to Tetra, who, spoiler alert, is revealed to be Princess Zelda much later on, giving a chance to engage with her outside of the perception of her being a princess, and rather just another person to talk with, allowing her and Link to bond a lot easier. Once the pirates have set sail with Link, there is a quick lesson on rope swinging to foreshadow the first dungeon item you pick up, the grappling hook. Without much time to rest, players are taken to Forsaken Fortress, where they'll immediately be stripped of the most important thing in the arsenal, the sword. This sets up the idea of using more than just your sword and brute force to make your way through this game. It's going to take lateral problem solving if you want to make it through. Although this premise is never fully realized throughout the entire game, it does make for a great and unique intro. Once players have met with the great evil Ganondorf, he tells his bird to do the dirty work, meaning the player is so underpowered at this point that Ganondorf doesn't even need to lay a finger on Link, really driving a sense of motivation to get powerful. Having been flung from Forsaken Fortress, Link wakes up at Windfall Island, which is a quick detour and proves that while the world is mostly water, it is still a living and breathing place, inhabited by people going about their days. Similar to Ocarina, players must obtain 80 rupees by breaking pots and exploring the nooks and crannies of the island for a sail so they can set off with the King of Red Lions. Luckily, the wind is in favor, and there's a nice straight shot to Dragon Roost Island for a taste of how sailing feels. This moment is just long enough to gauge the scope of the world, but not so long players get burnt out going in a straight line with no real threats in the way. This intro was built in such a way that, while it can't be shortened, it flows so well while being diverse enough that repeat plays rarely feel monotonous. Twilight Princess's intro seems to cop a bad rap from a lot of people, and honestly I can see why. There is a lot of tedium to be found with the goat herding and wrestling. While the former offers a brief tutorial on how to ride Epona, the wrestling moment is just foreshadowing something featured much later in the game, so it feels completely unnecessary. Twilight Princess feels like an amalgamation of all the previous 3D Zelda intros rolled into one. It takes the tutorial teaching of Wind Waker and the rupee collection of Ocarina to form a fetch quest chain that rivals Majora's Mask, all for the first half as human Link. After collecting a basket, doing some fishing and practicing weapon skills, players get to put their combat skills to the test by saving one of the children and a monkey from a cage. Shortly afterwards, the village is attacked and the Wolf Link intro begins. The argument could be made that Wind Waker introduced the idea of a second intro sequence. However, here there is a clear dividing line that separates the two, with being the obvious human and wolf forms. After Wolf Link is dragged off to his cell, Midna is introduced and informs players of different abilities they now have at their disposal. This sequence feels like a lower stakes version of the prison break in Wind Waker, in which you just need to make your way through some sewers with a couple of very obvious puzzles. Once the breakout is done, the game introduces Zelda, and contrary to Wind Waker, she is in her full princess form, but this time she's already lost the war to Zant. Twilight Princess is known for its darker and more gritty approach in both looks and in story. It's this moment here in the intro that really drives how dire things are in Hyrule. Sure, Ganondorf gains power in Ocarina, but that's not until after 3 whole dungeons. Here things are set up with a villain who got things done right away, raising the stakes for the entire adventure. While the village section has some obvious tedium, this is where the intro really starts to drag. Coupled with the Tears of Light fetch quest, it's easy to see why Twilight Princess isn't the highest praised in terms of its introductions. That said, this game does the best in any of the franchise at introducing us to the characters and the world. We get a glimpse in the day of the life of Ordon Village, as all the villagers are just simply going about their routines. When things are upended and Link is forced into a world beyond what he knows, there's a lot to care about because of the real sense of the imposing danger that has touched all of Hyrule, making us realize the severity of what's going on here. Skyward Sword may go down as a lesson how not to do a Zelda intro, really how an introduction to any game shouldn't go. Don't get me wrong, there is some charm to be found in the characters, primarily with Link and Zelda's relationship, as well as their connection to the people of Skyloft. Skyward Sword is the first time there's no main antagonist motivation. A few flashes of nightmarish creatures aside, the game relies on how much is built up between Link and Zelda as friends, using characters like Groose to ham-fist in moments about how close the two are getting. There is significantly more hand-holding than what's needed. Little things like this guy telling you how to push a block to gain access to higher ground, a concept that even the newest of players could grasp. This hand-holding is prominent throughout the entire game, adding what turns into hours of pointless interruptions, souring the entire experience. Oddly enough, the sword combat is one thing that is not painstakingly explained. With the exception of how to do a spin attack, it gives you the option to ask for help if you need it. I don't see how this wasn't implemented for all tutorial dumps in Skyloft. It feels distractingly out of place. Shortly after Link has been awarded the sailcloth by Zelda, and her disappearing in the mysterious storm, you're greeted by Fi to take the goddess sword, who is another point of contention in the game, as a very cold, calculating, and personality-less companion. Descending down to the surface world is a nice juxtaposition of barren sky to lush forest, but again, beneath the clouds offers nothing more than needless time wasting with text at almost every turn. But it's here we learn another big mechanic of the game. Dousing is a clever way around just having an arrow sit on top of Link's head, pointing him in the direction he's needing to go, or having a permanent minimap fixed on screen with a Witcher 3 style dotted line. But the execution of the mechanic is so slow, and with Fi's manner of speaking, it just comes off as cringy. While it doesn't serve to introduce Skyward Sword well, hopefully it can act as a lesson to anyone in how not to bloat your game's opening minutes with too much text and hand-holding. The evolution of Zelda introduction sequences is an interesting one. None rest on the laurels of the series' namesake, never repeating one introduction with a fresh coat of paint, but rather they borrow and build upon each other, for better or worse in some cases. What seems to make a good intro is introducing players into the world that waits ahead of them without forcing tedium or trivial tutorials upon them. Wind Waker strikes that perfect balance of world and character building, and at the same time teaches just enough of what is required to go forward on their own. Zelda 1, 2, and Ocarina of Time offer quick pick up and play intros that, while isn't a bad thing by any stretch, don't paint a picture of what the grander scope of the game is. Skyward Sword seems to be the end of overly intrusive and trivial tutorials, at least for a while. Although it does the best job of giving players the motivator needed with Link and Zelda's relationship, everything else gets too bogged down to really get set for a fun adventure. It's a test of patience to make it through rather than a fun introduction to a world. For the most part, each intro feels vastly different and none feel trapped in a cycle of predetermined conventions some people criticize the series for. This could be a factor as to why the series is so beloved by many. Each starts off so vastly different that, by the time we get to the meat of each game, it feels fresh. However, there is a reason people often debate their favorite Zelda titles, and the different approaches to intros is just one of those factors. When a slight pattern of sameness started to appear, it showed cracks in the rest of the series' approach to overall game design. Twilight Princess may get scorned a lot for taking introductions to drawn out and messy places, with Skyward Sword taking the worst parts and amplifying them. The series is in need of a shakeup, with Breath of the Wild stripping everything we've become comfortable with in the series, taking us back to where Zelda began. It seems to be a welcome breath of fresh air into a franchise that got a little bit too bloated.